In this last segment, I'll go back to what I said earlier when I mentioned the philosopher David Hume. And here's David Hume considering what he calls the environmental explanation for human differences. And David Hume argues that the environmental explanation doesn't make sense. He says that, look, there have been backward and low people all over the world. And there have been backward and low people in Europe. And he goes, and yet they have been able to come up. They've been able to better their condition. And so he says the idea that somebody is starting out behind and therefore must stay behind because of oppression or because of slavery, he goes, that's complete nonsense. He goes, let's look, for example, at all the people who were slaves in the Roman Empire. Yeah, they were slaves then. But are they slaves now? Are they uneducated now? Are they living in sort of hovels and terrible conditions now? Do they go, oh, the reason we're in terrible shape now is because of what happened to us 5,000 years ago? Hume goes, that's nonsense. They've obviously been able to overcome that historical disadvantage. They've obviously become competitive with people all around the world. And he goes, but that is not the case. This is Hume talking in Africa. He says that what happens in Black Africa is that this is a place that is not only backward now, and when I say now, he's talking about the 18th century, but has always been backward. And so his argument is that what's the reason for this? There is no development, and he says this has to be because these people are essentially backward by nature. Immanuel Kant kind of making the same point. Quote, among the whites, this is Kant writing, people constantly rise up from the lowest rabble and acquire esteem through their superior gift. So just as individuals can overcome their circumstances, Kant's point is groups can too. And therefore, this idea of blaming your backwardness on your circumstances is not entirely convincing. Now, the classic exposition, and I would say the inventor of modern racism, was a French writer named Joseph Arthur de Gobineau, actually an acquaintance of Tocqueville, who wrote a book called The Inequality of Human Races, published, by the way, 1853. He sends a copy to Tocqueville. Tocqueville is kind of offended. Not that Tocqueville disputes the book, but Tocqueville is offended by the moral implications of claiming that particular groups are inherently superior and inferior. Tocqueville thinks that this will fortify the pride of the groups that think they're better and will perpetually humiliate the groups that are seen as lesser. But let's look at what Gobineau is talking about. Basically, Gobineau says that there are people who attribute racial differences to climate and to environment. And Gobineau goes, that doesn't really work. Quote, in spite of wind and rain, cold and heat, sterility and fruitfulness, the world has seen barbarism and civilization flourishing everywhere on the same soil. So Gobineau is basically saying that if environmentalism is true, why have some places that have rich natural resources nevertheless failed to produce a civilization? And why are there places that have very poor natural resources nevertheless manage to develop very sophisticated cultures? This is Gobineau. So the brain of a Huron, he's talking about a Huron Indian. So the brain of a Huron Indian contains in an undeveloped form an intellect which is absolutely the same as an Englishman or Frenchman? And then says Gobineau, why then in the course of the ages has he not invented printing or steam power? This is Gobineau continuing. Nowhere is the soil more fertile, the climate more mild than in certain parts of America. There's an abundance of great rivers, the gulfs, the bays, the harbors. They're large, deep, magnificent, innumerable. Precious metals can be dug out almost at the surface of the ground. And he goes, if America has all these natural gifts, how come the American Indians haven't really come very far? He goes, where's the American Indian version of Caesar or Newton or Charlemagne or Homer? And this is Gobineau arguing, I would call it the racist thesis. What he says is that the only real civilization, the only rapidly modernizing civilization is coming from Europe, is coming from the white man. Now, he does notice that other civilizations are able to catch up. I think he's thinking here particularly of Asian cultures, but he goes, those cultures aren't inventors, they're basically imitators. He says that the civilization is something more than mere mimicry. It involves involves being able to do stuff on your own and come up with things on your own. And his argument is that no other culture is able to produce this kind of civilization. I'll close with this. He goes, I will wait long for the work to be finished. I merely ask that it may be begun, but it has never been begun. It has never even been attempted. And now my conclusion, which is this: that it's actually very important for us to recover the origin of racism because it shows us that racism had a beginning in space and time. Racism actually began with the assertion of Western cultural superiority, which was then asserted to be biological or intrinsic. And I draw from this a kind of consoling or even optimistic conclusion, and that is that there is no historical warrant for the extreme pessimism which says racism has always existed and therefore racism will always exist. Even though it's kind of painful to listen to what people in ancient times, or at least in early modern times, had to say about each other, it is profoundly consoling to know that racism had a beginning, because it then becomes possible to envision its end.